Give it back to me." Those 4 words came out so quiet, so absolutely still, that the passengers who heard them would later say it was the stillness that frightened them more than anything else that happened on that flight, more than the sound of the clasp snapping, more than the children screaming, more than the sight of a flight attendant standing in the middle of a full airplane holding a dead woman's necklace in her closed fist like it was something she had every right to take. It happened without warning. It happened without a question. One moment, Adeline Hayes was sitting in row 12 of a Delta flight from Atlanta to New York, and the next moment, a white hand had closed around the gold chain at her throat. Closed around it the way you pull a weed out of the ground with the specific certainty of someone who has decided the thing they are removing does not belong where it is, and the clasp snapped against the back of a 74-year-old woman's neck with a sound so small and so final that it seemed impossible it could carry the weight it carried. The children screamed. Zora, 13 years old, and her grandmother's shadow in every good way made a sound that was pure and undone and had no words in it. Eli 10 jolted awake from the half-sleep he had drifted into against Adeline's arm and pressed himself back against the window with both hands gripping the armrest, his eyes wide and trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Around them, the cabin froze, not all at once, but in a wave row by row, as the sound and the movement and the meaning of it traveled outward from seat 12C like a stone dropped into still water. Flight attendant Brittany Cole stood in the aisle holding Pearl Hayes' necklace, a simple gold chain with a small oval locket no bigger than a thumbnail. And her expression in that moment was the expression of someone who believed she had just solved a problem. The locket swung once, twice, catching the overhead light. Inside it was a photograph that Brittany Cole could not see and would never understand. Inside it was 73 years of a woman's life. Adeline looked at the necklace in Brittany's hand. She looked at it the way your mind looks at something it cannot immediately root through any category it has for the world, the way information arrives that simply does not fit, that keeps coming back wrong no matter how many times you try to process it, her mother's necklace. The one Pearl Hayes had worn in every photograph Adeline had ever seen of her. The one that had been against Pearl's chest on the morning she died, warm and gold, and present unfastened by Adeline's own hands in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and early light. In this woman's fist. 3 seconds passed. The cabin held its breath. Then Adeline Hayes stood up. "We need to go back 6 hours to where the morning began and what it was carrying so that you understand what those 3 seconds cost and what it meant that she stood up anyway. If this story moves you, please like and subscribe to our channel, because the fight for dignity is not over, and the next story we tell might be the one that changes everything." The alarm in the Charlotte house went off at 5:40 in the morning, and Adeline Hayes was already awake. She had been awake for 20 minutes, lying in the particular stillness of someone who has given up on sleep and made peace with it, listening to the sounds of the house, the refrigerator's low hum, the tick of the hallway radiator, the faint creak of Zora shifting in the bed in the guest room down the hall. These were the sounds of a house that still felt like hers, even when it was quiet, the sounds of a life she had built from scratch and cared for through everything. And she lay in them for a few minutes before she got up, because at 74 she had learned that mornings are worth tasting before you start moving through them. She washed her face. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen counter in the gray pre-dawn and went through the ritual she had been performing every morning for 7 months, since the day Pearl Hayes passed at 97 years old in a hospital bed with her family around her and her gold chain at her throat. She picked up the necklace from the small dish on the counter where it lived. She held it for a moment in both hands. The chain cool, the locket lighter than it looked. The oval face of it smooth under her thumb. She thought about her mother the way she always thought about her mother in this moment. Not with grief exactly, because grief had mostly settled into something quieter and more permanent, but with the particular awareness of absence that never fully becomes ordinary. Then she fastened it around her own neck, the clasp clicking shut with the familiar small sound, and the locket settled against her chest where it had always belonged. Upstairs, getting the children ready was the particular organized chaos of a grandmother who has done this before and knows that the key is to start with shoes. Zora was 13 and had her late mother's gold bracelet on her left wrist. Adeline's daughter-in-law Renata gone 4 years now from a cancer that moved faster than anyone had prepared for, leaving Adeline's son, Isaiah, hollowed out in ways he was still slowly rebuilding. The bracelet had been Renata's everyday piece, nothing fancy, just a fine gold chain that she had worn since before she and Isaiah met, and Zora wore it now the way you carry something you know is irreplaceable carefully without making a production of the care. Eli was 10 and wore a small cross necklace on a thin chain, a birthday gift from Pearl herself on his 6th birthday, his great-grandmother pressing it into his hands at the kitchen table with the particular ceremony of someone who understood exactly what they were giving and to whom. He had worn it almost every day since. He wore it today with the same unconscious naturalness as breathing. Adeline looked at her grandchildren in the early morning light of her kitchen. Zora checking the zipper of her carry-on for the 3rd time, Eli eating cereal with the focused attention of someone for whom breakfast is a serious undertaking, and she felt the weight of what they were all wearing without any of them remarking on it. The way you feel something that is so much a part of daily life that noticing it requires a kind of deliberate stepping back. They were a family dressed in their history. Zora's bracelet was her mother's. Eli's cross was his great-grandmother's. Adeline's wedding band, which she still wore 21 years after Joseph Hayes passed of a stroke on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other Tuesday, was the same ring he had placed on her finger 40 years before that. And Pearl's necklace was... Pearl's. Was the physical fact of Pearl still present, still close, still part of every ordinary morning and every flight home, and every small moment that did not seem worth remarking on, until suddenly, violently, it was. None of that, of course, meant anything to Brittany Cole. But we will get to Brittany Cole. There are people in the world who walk into rooms and the rooms change, not because of anything those people do or say, but simply because of the quality of their presence. The specific density of someone who has lived a great deal and processed it honestly and arrived at a kind of stillness that is not passivity, but its opposite. A stillness that is the result of having been tested and not broken and knowing it. Adeline Hayes was that kind of person, and she had been that kind of person for a long time, long enough that she no longer thought about it consciously, but simply inhabited it the way you inhabit a house you have lived in for decades. She was born in Greenville, South Carolina, in 1950, the second of Pearl and Franklin Hayes's 4 children, and she grew up knowing, not learning, knowing the way children absorb the truth of their environment before they have language for it. Exactly what the world thought of her before she opened her mouth. She grew up in the years when the water fountains were labeled and the back of the bus was not a metaphor, and the weight of being looked through by people who had decided you were invisible was something you carried so constantly that you eventually stopped noticing. It was there the way you stopped noticing the weight of your own clothes. She noticed it later. She noticed it in the specific way that people notice things they were too young to name when they first encountered them, once they have acquired the words. She had been a hospital administrator for 31 years, rising from a clerical position at a county hospital in Charlotte to senior director of operations at a regional medical center, retiring at 67, with the particular satisfaction of a person who had done serious work and done it well. She had navigated her entire career in rooms where people assumed she was the help before she was the person in charge, and she had navigated it without bitterness. Not because the bitterness wasn't warranted, but because she had decided somewhere in her 30s that bitterness was a weight she could not afford to carry in addition to everything else. Her daughter Nadia was 46, tall and precise and formidable, a civil rights attorney and partner at a firm in New York that had won 3 precedent-setting discrimination cases in the last decade, currently serving as lead counsel for a coalition of voting rights organizations across 5 states. Adeline mentioned this the way mothers mention their children's work with pride, that has settled past the need to perform itself casually, naturally, the way you might mention the weather. And she did not know, sitting in her kitchen that morning at 5:40 a.m., that within 6 hours, Nadia's specific expertise was going to matter in ways that neither of them had anticipated. Her son, Isaiah, was in Charlotte, still rebuilding, doing well enough. Her brother Calvin was in Atlanta, 71 years old, Delta Medallion member with nearly 400,000 miles a man, with a direct line to the airline's executive customer relations office, and the specific energy of a person who treats an injustice against his family as a personal emergency requiring immediate mobilization. Adeline loved him completely, and he was frequently a headache. She was the kind of woman who had already read everything, already asked every question, and would not be moved by volume or the performance of authority, only by the actual documented, verifiable thing itself. She had been this way since she was young, and the years had not softened it, only refined it the way pressure refines certain materials into something harder and more precise. Brittany Cole was 31 years old, platinum blonde hair pulled into a severe bun that did not move 5 years, with Delta assigned to the Atlanta-New York route on a rotation she had held long enough that some of the regular business travelers knew her name. She was efficient. Her colleagues used that word about her consistently and with the slightly careful intonation of people who mean it as a compliment, but are aware it is not the only true thing they could say. She moved through a cabin the way certain people move through spaces, with the specific forward-leaning energy of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and requires everyone around them to confirm it. She did the pre-departure walkthrough with the focused momentum of a woman running a clock, and as she passed through the rows, she offered champagne to the white executive in 2B, without being asked, laughed easily at his comment about the Atlanta traffic, and fetched reading glasses for the elderly white woman in 4A, who had left hers in her carry-on, doing it with the genuine warmth of someone who found genuine pleasure in being useful to certain people. When she reached row 12, her body language shifted. It was not a large shift. It was the kind of shift that most people would not catch, a fractional tightening around the eyes, a slight adjustment in the angle of her shoulders, a micro-pause in her forward momentum that lasted perhaps half a second before she continued past. Most of the people in that cabin did not notice it. Adeline Hayes, who had spent 74 years developing the particular observational capacity of someone who has always needed to know what a room is doing, noticed it completely. What Adeline also noticed, what she filed away without reacting to the way you file away a detail whose significance you don't yet fully understand, was where Brittany's eyes went in that half-second of pause. Not to the row in general, not to the seat configuration or the overhead bins or the boarding manifest in her hand, to the gold chain at Adeline's throat, to Pearl's necklace specifically, with a look that was not aesthetic judgment, was not curiosity, was not the reflexive glance of someone cataloging the cabin. It was the look of recognition and decision, the look of someone who has seen something they have already decided what to do about. Adeline did not know this, yet not consciously, not in words. She felt it. She filed it. She filed. She settled her grandchildren into their seats and watched the rest of the boarding passengers and waited to understand what she had just seen. She would understand it before the flight was over. The gate area at Hartsfield-Jackson was doing what airport gate areas always do, which is to say it was moving at 4 different speeds simultaneously and making a sound like the inside of a held breath, and Adeline sat in one of the padded chairs near the window with Eli on her left, watching something on a tablet, and Zora on her right, reading with the focused completeness of a girl who disappears into books the way other people disappear into sleep. It was on the surface an ordinary Tuesday morning. Adeline had a cup of coffee going cold beside her and a paperback face down in her lap that she had not actually been reading because watching her grandchildren in transit was something she found more interesting than most novels, and she was content in the specific way that grandmothers are content when their grandchildren are safe and occupied and within arm's reach. The gate agent asked to see her boarding pass a second time, despite having scanned it 60 seconds earlier with the specific phrasing of someone who has decided there has been an error without yet identifying what the error is. Adeline produced it without comment. The agent scanned it again. Green light. The agent's expression did not fully reorganize itself into apology, just moved on. Zora looked up from her book. She had seen it. At 13, she saw most things with the sharp lateral attention of a child who has been paying careful attention to the world since she was old enough to understand that the world requires it. Why did she do that? Zora asked quietly, not loudly, not in a way that carried. Just to her grandmother. Adeline considered how to answer this the way she had considered versions of this question across Zora's entire childhood. How much truth? How much protection, how much context, where the line was between honest and burdening. She had been answering this question in different forms for her own children before Zora was born. She decided something without checking first. Adeline said. Then she checked. Then she moved on. Zora looked at her with the 13-year-old eyes that were sometimes 40. She decided we were in the wrong place. She thought so. The ticket disagreed. Zora held her grandmother's gaze for a moment and then nodded once and went back to her book with the particular quiet of a child who has understood something she did not entirely want to understand. Inside the plane, 2 rows behind where Adeline and the children would sit, a man in his early 60s settled into his window seat with a legal brief and the unhurried manner of someone for whom air travel has long since lost its novelty. His name was Judge Raymond Osei, retired from the U.S. District Court, Southern District of New York, 28 years on the federal bench traveling home to New York after delivering a keynote on judicial ethics at a conference in Atlanta. He had specifically requested this window seat because the angle of the afternoon light through this particular row was the only thing that made reading on planes bearable. He opened his brief. He noticed briefly the grandmother and her grandchildren settling into row 12. He went back to his reading. 2 rows ahead of Adeline. Dr. Patricia Wynn, constitutional law professor, arranged her books on the tray table before the plane had even finished boarding, the organized instinct of a woman who has learned that preparation is a form of respect for your own time. The flight filled. The door sealed. Everything was ordinary. 30 minutes into the flight, cruising at altitude. The cabin had settled into the specific, loose quiet of a plane that has left the city behind and not yet begun its arrival. Rituals, seatbelt signs, dimmed. A few overhead bins opened and resealed the low ambient conversation of people who have decided the person next to them is acceptable company. Adeline was helping Eli with the clasp on his tablet case when she heard the footsteps, and she recognized them before she looked up the specific click and cadence of someone who has made a decision and is walking toward its execution. Brittany Cole stopped at row 12 with her hands loosely clasped in front of her, and the professional pleasantness on her face that had just enough edge underneath it to communicate that the pleasantness was a tool rather than a feeling. "Ma'am," she said, and the word had that particular inflection, the inflection Adeline had been receiving from certain kinds of people since she was 19 years old, the inflection that contains within it the assumption that the person being addressed requires management. "I'm going to need you to remove your jewelry before we reach cruising altitude." Adeline looked up from Eli's tablet case slowly, and with the full attention of someone who intends to understand exactly what is being said to them. "I'm sorry. The jewelry," Brittany said, gesturing in a way that encompassed the necklace, the wedding ring, and the children's pieces, without landing specifically on any of them. "You'll need to take it off and store it in your carry-on for the duration of the flight. It's a safety directive." Adeline let the sentence sit for a moment. Not because she didn't understand it, she understood it perfectly, but because she had learned decades ago that the first response to something like this was not reaction but comprehension, full and unhurried. "What regulation is that?" she asked. "It's policy, ma'am." "Whose policy?" "Under what FAA provision?" Brittany blinked a small, quick calibration. "I don't carry the policy manual on the floor, ma'am, but I am authorized to enforce cabin safety directives. Authorized by which specific regulation?" The calibration happened again, slightly less small this time. "I'm not going to debate this with you. I need you to comply." Adeline set Eli's tablet case on the tray table and gave Brittany her full attention in a way that was entirely calm and entirely unmistakable. She had worked in hospital administration for 31 years. She had attended more meetings with more people who believed authority was the same as correctness than she could count. She knew the difference between a rule and the performance of a rule, and she knew which one she was looking at. "This necklace," she said, "belonged to my mother. She passed 7 months ago. She wore this necklace every day of her adult life for over 70 years. This bracelet," she gestured to Zora's wrist, "belonged to my grandchildren's mother who passed 4 years ago. These are family heirlooms. They are not coming off." Brittany's professional pleasantness developed a harder texture. "Ma'am, I understand that, but—" "No," Adeline said, and the word was not loud, was not heated, was simply final in the way that certain words are final when spoken by certain people. "I don't think you do." The pause that followed had weight in it, the specific weight of a conversation that has revealed more about both parties than either of them intended. Across the aisle, a woman removed her headphones. 2 rows forward, Dr. Patricia Wynn's hand went still on the page of her book. Grandma Zora said quietly, "What's wrong?" "Nothing, baby," Adeline said, and she said it with the calm of someone who knows exactly what is happening and is not afraid of it and does not want her grandchildren to be afraid of it either. "We're just having a conversation." Brittany turned and walked toward the front of the cabin with the stride of a woman controlling herself carefully. Her footsteps had a clipped, purposeful quality. She was going to get someone. Adeline watched her go. She put her arm around Eli, who had gone still, and she breathed slowly from the bottom the way Pearl had taught her. The 4 minutes that Brittany was gone were not quiet. Exactly. The engines kept their low constant note, and the cabin kept its ambient shuffle, but they were the kind of not quiet that has a shape to it. The shape of people who have heard something and are processing what they heard, and deciding what to do with what they know. The man in 2B had closed his laptop. The woman across the aisle had her headphones fully off now and was looking at no one in particular with the particular studied neutrality of someone who is paying close attention. 2 rows forward, Dr. Patricia Wynn had turned a page she had not read. Judge Raymond Osei had set down his legal brief entirely. He was not looking at row 12. He was looking at the middle distance with the specific stillness of a man who has spent decades watching people reveal themselves and knows when a revelation is in progress. Brittany returned with lead attendant Stephen Marsh, who was younger than her by several years, and had the look of someone who had been pulled away from something and was still calibrating how serious this was going to be. He was consulting what appeared to be the seating manifest. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, arriving at the row with the careful, professional warmth of a man doing rapid situational assessment. "I'm Stephen lead cabin crew for this flight. Jennifer Brittany has informed me that you're declining to follow a safety directive, and I just want to—" "Brittany informed you incorrectly," Adeline said, and her voice was so even it was almost musical, which was a quality it had when she was being most precise. "Brittany asked me to remove jewelry that has no legitimate connection to any safety policy I have encountered in 40 years of flying. I asked her to show me the specific policy in writing. She was unable to do that. I declined to comply with an unexplained and unverifiable demand, and I intend to continue declining." Stephen opened his mouth and then closed it again, which was the response of a man who had expected something different from what he was getting. "Our crew members are empowered to make judgment calls regarding passenger safety," he said carefully. "Under what authority?" Adeline asked. "Cited from which specific FAA regulation?" "What part of the Code of Federal Regulations covers in-flight jewelry removal?" "Because I am familiar with FAA requirements regarding metal accessories in medical contexts, and I am not familiar with any airborne jewelry prohibition." "Are you?" The silence that followed this was the particular silence of a person who has realized they are significantly less prepared than the person they are speaking to. A voice came from 2 rows back. Harold, a big, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with the steady, unhurried quality of someone who has spent a career asking questions that expected answers. "Is there a problem?" he asked, not loudly. "Because from where I'm sitting, I'm watching a flight attendant tell an elderly woman to take off her dead mother's necklace, and I'd genuinely like to understand what the actual violation is." Brittany turned. "Sir, this is a crew matter." "You're having it in the middle of a full airplane," Harold said. "That's not private. What is the regulation you're citing Dr. Wynne from 2 rows ahead without turning?" She asked to see it in writing, and the answer was that it wasn't available. "I heard that clearly." Brittany's jaw tightened in a way that was visible from several rows in any direction. "I need everyone to mind their own business." "Noted," Harold said, and did not move. Stephen pulled Brittany aside not far, just to the galley entrance, just enough to have a conversation that was technically private in a space where nothing was actually private, and whatever he said to her during those 2 minutes had the tone from where Adeline was sitting of a man trying to de-escalate something he sensed was moving in a direction he didn't want to follow it. Adeline used the 2 minutes. She reached into her bag, found her phone, and called Nadia. The call connected on the second ring, and in the half-second before Nadia spoke, Adeline could hear the background of a busy office keyboards, a muffled conversation in another room, the sounds of a workday in full motion. "Mom? Why are you calling from the plane?" "Is everything Nadia?" Adeline's voice was the specific calm that had a vibration underneath it. The calm that Nadia had been able to read since she was a small child, the calm her mother only used when something was genuinely wrong and she had decided to handle it without drama. "I need you to listen carefully." The background sounds on Nadia's end went silent. Wherever she was, whatever she was doing, she had stopped. "Talk to me." Adeline delivered the facts in order. The approach. The demand. The request to see it in writing. The inability to produce it. Stephen's arrival, the passengers who had spoken up the current state of the situation. All of it, in the measured, sequential way she had learned to deliver information over 31 years of hospital administration, where the way you told the story mattered as much as the story itself. The silence on Nadia's end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, "Are you recording?" "Not yet. Start recording right now and do not stop until you are off that plane." "What is the flight number?" It was not a question. Adeline read it from her boarding pass. Names, she gave Brittany's. She gave Stephen's. Okay. The specific sound of a laptop being pulled open with deliberate force. "Mom, stay exactly where you are. You have done absolutely nothing wrong. I'm pulling Delta's regulatory filings right now, and I'm also calling James Achebe." James Achebe was the civil rights attorney Nadia's firm had co-counseled with on 2 of their 3 landmark cases. 24 years in practice, 4 wins against major carriers. The kind of reputation in civil rights legal circles that meant his name produced a specific silence in corporate legal departments. Adeline knew who he was. Nadia invoked his name the way you invoke a serious instrument when a situation has escalated past the casual. Nadia Mom. For just half a second, Nadia's voice dropped out of its attorney register and into the register of a daughter. the specific voice of a woman who still every day heard something of her grandmother in her mother's face. The necklace stays on. Adeline closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Yes, she said. It does. She hung up and opened her recording app. She set the phone on the tray table, face up quiet, doing its job. Then she looked at her grandchildren, Zora, watchful and trying not to show it. Eli, who had leaned against her arm again with the specific pressure of a child who knows something is wrong, and has decided the best response is to be physically close to the person he trusts most. It's all right, she told them, and she meant it in the specific way that it was all right. Not that nothing was happening, not that the thing that was happening was acceptable, but that they were going to be all right through it, which was a different and more important kind of all right. Brittany came back down the aisle without Stephen. She came back different. The professional pleasantness was entirely gone, now replaced by something that had decided it was in charge and required everyone around it to confirm that decision. The specific bearing of a person who has gone somewhere and come back feeling more powerful than when they left, whether that power was real or imagined. Mrs. Hayes Brittany said, and the way she said the name communicated that she was using it as a formality rather than a courtesy. I have spoken with the captain. He has authorized me to inform you that your continued non-compliance with crew directives is a violation of federal aviation regulations, and if you do not remove the jewelry immediately, this aircraft will be returning to the gate. The cabin did not just register this. It reacted a wave of response that moved through the rows audible and unmistakable people, shifting people exchanging looks. Someone several rows back, making a sound that was not a word, but communicated several things at once. Harold, from 2 rows behind Adeline, said in a voice that had gone very quiet in the way that is more alarming than loudness, "You're going to turn back a full plane. Over a necklace." Brittany turned. "Sir, the captain's authority is not the same as federal aviation regulations," Dr. Wynne said from 2 rows ahead, and she said it with the specific unhurried precision of someone for whom these distinctions are a professional matter rather than a conversational point. Those are 2 different legal instruments, and one does not supersede the other. Brittany looked at the back of Dr. Wynne's silver hair. "Are you a lawyer, constitutional law professor?" Dr. Wynne said. 29 years. There is a meaningful difference between what a captain may do under discretionary authority and what federal passenger rights regulations actually require. She turned a page without looking up. I'd be happy to explain it in more detail if that would be useful. Something moved through the cabin, not quite a laugh. Something closer to the collective exhale of a group of people who have been holding their breath and have just been given permission to recognize what they are watching. Brittany's face went red in a way that had nothing to do with warmth. She turned back to Adeline and leaned in not far, just enough to drop her voice to something meant to be intimate and intimidating, the specific register of a person who has decided that proximity is authority and said the thing that crossed the line. "I don't know who you think you are," she said low and certain, "but on this plane I am the authority, and you will do what I tell you." The cabin went absolutely quiet. Adeline looked at this woman. She looked at her the way she had been looking at versions of this moment her entire life, the way you look at something you want to see all the way through before you respond to it clearly without the distortion of reaction. She was 74 years old. She had grown up in Greenville, South Carolina, in a decade when this particular certainty, the certainty that she was required to comply with the preferences of people who looked like Brittany Cole, was not a subtext, but a law. She had outlasted everyone who had ever delivered that certainty to her. She was not afraid of it now. "My phone," she said, her voice perfectly, preternaturally calm, "has been recording since you began this interaction." She indicated the phone on the tray table without looking at it. "My daughter is an attorney currently on the phone with Delta Corporate with your full name, Stephen Marsh's full name, this flight number, and a list of passengers who have already vocally objected to your conduct." She paused. Would you like to continue telling me who has authority here? One person began to clap, slow, deliberate from somewhere in the rows behind her. Then another. Then Harold, then Dr. Wynne, then the young woman across the aisle who had not said a single word, and the couple 2 rows back, and within 30 seconds the entire section was applauding, not wildly, not performatively, but with the specific, considered energy of people who have watched something and have decided what they think of it. Brittany walked away from them. The cabin settled into something that felt like breath after holding, but the door was not fully closed. The applause died and the cabin settled into 4 minutes that were almost quiet, the kind of almost quiet that has an edge to it, a low-frequency awareness that something is not finished, even though the immediate noise has stopped. Adeline kept her hand near her phone without picking it up. She was not looking at the front of the plane, not staring at the galley where Brittany had retreated, not tracking the movements of the crew with the visible attention of someone who is waiting for the next thing. But she was aware of it all the way. You are aware of a door that is not fully latched, the low constant attention of someone who has been in enough difficult situations to know that the gap between rounds is not the same as the end of the fight. Eli was leaning against her arm again. Zora was pretending to look out the window and was clearly listening to everything. Nadia called back. "Mom, I'm on hold with Delta Corporate. I've been on hold 11 minutes. I have the flight number. I have both names. I have the time of first contact logged. Are you still okay?" "Still okay," Adeline said quietly. "Is the recording running?" "Yes." "Good. Don't stop it for any reason." A brief pause. "How are the kids?" Adeline looked at Zora, who was very clearly listening to every word while continuing to perform interest in the cloud cover outside the window. "They're being brave," she said. "They got that from somewhere." Nadia's voice carried something in it that was not quite sentiment and not quite humor, but lived in the warm space between those two things. Then it shifted back. "Mom, I also called Calvin." Adeline went still. "Nadia, before you say anything, Calvin has direct access to Delta's Executive Customer Relations Office. He has nearly 400,000 miles with them, and he will absolutely use both of those things right now. I texted him 20 minutes ago." Adeline closed her eyes briefly. Her brother Calvin, 71 years old, had the energy of a man 30 years younger when he felt an injustice had been done to his family. She loved him completely and unreservedly, and he could be counted on to do something both effective and excessive simultaneously. "Tell him not to threaten anyone," she said. "I told him 3 times to be firm and professional." "Nadia, 3 times Mom. I'm handling it." A beat. "If she comes back, let her talk first. Don't interrupt. Let the recording get every word and then respond. Don't let her make you the one who escalated," Angela Adeline said. I know you have. Quiet, genuine. I'll call the second I'm through." Brittany came back 7 minutes later, and this time she began with silence, the pressurized kind, the kind that is deployed as an instrument designed to make the other person feel the need to fill it with words that can then be used against them. Adeline did not fill it. She waited, hands in her lap phone, face up on the tray table, with the patient stillness of someone who has decided that time is on her side. "The captain," Brittany said finally, "has made a decision." She let that sit for a beat in a way that was meant to convey gravity. "You are to be removed from this aircraft." The cabin did not simply react. It convulsed. The response moved through the rows like a current. Not one voice, but many overlapping and immediate and unmistakable. Harold said loudly enough for 5 rows to hear it, "You have got to be kidding me." The man directly across the aisle from Adeline, who had not said a single word for the entire flight, looked up from his phone and said flatly and with total calm, "For a necklace." Behind Adeline, a young woman's voice said, "I'm recording this too. and when Adeline glanced back, she saw a phone raised camera facing forward, a second record beginning. Zora said nothing. She looked at Brittany with the specific expression of a 13-year-old who has just understood something about the world that she cannot unknow. Not fear, not anger, but the particular clear-eyed recognition of a child who has been paying attention and has just had her attention confirmed as necessary. It was the most heartbreaking thing Adeline had seen all morning, and she had seen several heartbreaking things. Eli grabbed his grandmother's arm with both hands. Adeline looked at Brittany with the full steady attention of someone who is not going to be frightened and is not going to pretend. On what grounds, she said. Non-compliance with crew directives. I have complied with every legitimate directive issued on this aircraft. Adeline said, her voice unhurried and precise, the voice of someone reading from a list they have already prepared. I fastened my seatbelt. I turned off my Bluetooth device. I stowed my carry-on in the designated space. I have not raised my voice. I have not made threats. I have not touched anyone or anything that was not mine. She paused. Can you say the same? Brittany's eyes went to the phone on the tray table. You need to put that away. Passengers are permitted to record interactions with cabin crew in flight under federal guidelines. I can cite the specific provision if you'd like. Mrs. Hayes. Would you like me to cite it? Harold said from 2 rows back, already pulling something up on his phone. I have it right here if anyone needs it. Brittany spun toward him. Sir, I am warning you for the last time, warning me of what Harold said, and he was not angry exactly. He was something steadier than anger, something that had been building since the moment Brittany first stood at row 12 and had calcified over the last 30 minutes into something entirely immovable. Warning me that you'll remove me too. Go ahead. Remove me. Remove the professor up there who knows her regulatory distinctions. Remove whoever else in this cabin wants to say they saw what they saw. He gestured around the cabin with the easy authority of a man who knows he is in the right and has decided to occupy that knowledge fully. Let's see how that conversation goes for Delta tonight. Brittany turned back to Adeline. And this was the moment, the specific, identifiable moment where the restraint or calculation or whatever had been guiding her behavior across the previous 40 minutes finally gave way to something reflexive and revealing. The moment where a person stops performing authority and starts enacting something else entirely. She reached out her hand. She didn't ask. She didn't warn. She reached out and closed her fingers around Pearl Hayes' necklace and pulled. The clasp held for 1 searing second against the back of Adeline's neck, held with the specific resistance of a thing that was made to stay, that had stayed through 73 years of Pearl's life and 7 months of Adeline's, that had been fastened and unfastened thousands of times by the careful hands of women who understood what they were handling. Then it didn't. The chain broke free with a sound so small, a soft, sharp snap, barely audible above the engine noise, and yet somehow every person within 10 rows heard it. Not just heard it, registered it in the specific way that the body registers sounds whose smallness is wrong, sounds whose scale does not match their weight. Zora's cry was immediate and unguarded. The sound of a girl who has been holding herself together for 40 minutes and has just reached the end of what composure can hold. Eli, who had drifted into a light sleep against his grandmother's arm despite everything, jolted fully awake at his sister's voice and pressed himself against the window with both hands gripping the armrest. His eyes wide, trying to assemble what he was seeing into something that made sense. Brittany Cole stood in the aisle with Pearl Hayes' necklace hanging from her closed fist, the chain draped over her knuckles. The locket, the small oval locket with the photograph inside the photograph of Pearl as a young woman before Adeline was born. The photograph Pearl had chosen to keep closest to her heart for more than half a century, swung once, twice catching the overhead light. Adeline looked at it. She looked at it with the specific cognitive delay of something that cannot be immediately processed the way information arrives, that the mind keeps trying to sort, and the sort keeps coming back wrong, because the category for this thing does not exist in her understanding of how the world is allowed to work. Her mother's necklace, the one Pearl had worn in every photograph, the one that had been on Pearl's neck in the hospital on her last morning, warm against her skin, unfastened by Adeline's own hands carefully, the clasp opening so easily, the chain coiling into her palm like something alive becoming still. In this woman's fist. The people in the adjacent rows were making sounds, gasps, voices, the specific kind of reaction that people have when they have witnessed something that crosses a line they did not know had a location until this moment. The young woman behind Adeline was filming openly now. A man several rows forward had stood halfway up from his seat. The couple across the aisle were both gripping their armrests. Adeline did not look at any of them. She looked at the necklace. She looked at it for 3 seconds. 3 full seconds, not rushing, not reacting, just seeing. And then something in the room changed. A subtle shift in pressure, in weight, in the quality of the attention everyone in those rows was paying to row 12 because Adeline Hayes had made a decision that was visible in her body before she moved at all. She stood up. She was not a large woman. She was 74 years old and 5 feet 3 inches, and she had arthritis in her right knee that her doctor had been asking her to do something about for 2 years, and she stood up the way she had always done things that mattered, without performance, without drama, without speed, slowly from some place beneath the surface, with the specific weight of someone whose authority comes from somewhere that has nothing to do with size or volume. When she was fully standing, she looked at Brittany Cole from 12 inches away. And what was in her eyes in that moment, the full, complete, clear, unfrightened look of a woman who had been told versions of this her entire life and had outlasted every person who delivered it, made 2 passengers in adjacent rows physically lean back from the interaction without intending to. "Give me my mother's necklace," she said. Her voice was so quiet, so absolutely without escalation that it was more frightening than any volume could have been the specific fearlessness of a person who is not performing calm, but actually is calm, because they have decided that this moment does not have the power to undo them. Brittany took a half step back. The movement was instinctive, and she caught herself squaring her shoulders, trying to recover the posture of authority she had been carrying all morning, but the half-step had already happened, and everyone in the surrounding rows had seen it. "Give me my mother's necklace," Adeline said again. Same volume, same tone, same absolute rooted stillness. Harold was already out of his seat behind her, not moving toward Brittany. Not threatening, simply standing occupying the space with the unmistakable quality of someone who is there and is not leaving and does not require permission. The young woman with the phone had come down the aisle and was filming from 6 feet away. Dr. Patricia Wynne had turned fully around in her seat for the first time in the flight, and she was watching with the specific attention of a woman who is assembling what she will need to say later. Judge Raymond Osei, 2 rows back, had closed his legal brief. He had uncapped a pen. He had opened a small leather notepad to a clean page. He was writing with the careful, deliberate precision of a man who knows that his words are instruments and is choosing them accordingly. He did not announce himself. He did not intervene. He wrote. Stephen Marsh appeared at a near jog from the direction of the galley, arriving at Brittany's side with his voice tight and low and urgent, and what he said to her was, "Give it back. Now. Give her the necklace back right now." And there was in his voice the specific urgency of someone who has understood too late the full weight of what has happened in the last 40 minutes and is trying to stop more of it. The terrible suspended moment, Brittany Cole standing in the center of everything she had built, holding a dead woman's necklace surrounded by witnesses, recording running on the tray table, her colleague's hand on her arm, 70 or 80 people watching, and then she held it out. Adeline took it. She held it in her palm, the broken chain, the clasp snapped at the join the locket perfectly intact, the photograph inside untouched. She closed her fingers around it, and for one moment, one single private moment that belonged only to her, her face changed. The composure flickered. Not fear, not anger, something older and deeper and more private than either of those. Grief. The grief of a thing you have been protecting being touched by something it should never have had to touch. Then it was gone. Her face reset. She looked at Stephen Marsh. "I want the captain," she said. "In this cabin. Now. I want this recorded in the official incident log as of—" She glanced at Eli's watch. 10:14 a.m., and I want Brittany Cole away from me and my grandchildren for the remainder of this flight. Stephen nodded. He was already reaching for his intercom. The locket was warm in Adeline's closed hand, and what came to her in the moment, she closed her fingers around it. What arrived without invitation. The way memory always arrives when the body recognizes something that the mind is not yet ready to name. Was not the cabin around her, not the sound of Stephen's voice on the intercom, not the low murmur of the passengers reassembling themselves into something like ordinary. What came to her was Pearl. Pearl Hayes, born 1927 in Orangeburg County, South Carolina, the eldest of 6 children of a family that sharecropped tobacco on land that would never be theirs. Pearl, who had grown up in a house with 4 rooms and no running water, and the particular dignity of people who have been given nothing they did not make themselves. Pearl, who had been given the necklace by her own mother, Cora, on the morning she turned 18 and left for Greenville to find work. Cora saving for 2 years, 2 entire years of setting aside whatever she could from the household's margin, which was very thin, to buy this small piece of gold to press into her eldest daughter's hand at the bus stop, the way you give someone something they can carry with them into whatever comes next. The words Cora said when she fastened it, according to Pearl, who had told the story to Adeline dozens of times over the years, were not dramatic and were not a speech. They were the plain declarative words of a woman who understood that truth doesn't need decoration. You carry this so you remember you come from people who endured. Pearl had endured. She worked as a domestic in Greenville for 11 years, cooking, cleaning, raising other people's children in houses where she used a different entrance and ate before the family so she would not be in the way, and addressed the children of the household as Master and Miss, while they called her Pearl. Only Pearl, always only Pearl. She did all of it without breaking. Not because it wasn't breaking her. She had told Adeline this directly in her kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, when Adeline was in her 30s. In the plain, honest way, Pearl told the things that mattered, but because breaking was not something she could afford, not with 6 people depending on the money she sent home every month and a plan she was building one saved dollar at a time. The necklace was on her throat through all of it. Every morning she fastened it. Every evening she unfastened it. The ritual of it was the one thing that was entirely hers in days that were largely organized around the needs and preferences of other people. And she maintained it with the consistency of someone who understands that small acts of self-possession are sometimes the most radical things available to you. In 1961, Pearl Hayes bought her own small house in Greenville. She was 34 years old. She had been working 2 jobs for 6 years and saving with the specific discipline of someone who has decided that ownership is not a dream but a plan. And the day she walked through the door of that house, a door that was hers, a threshold that was hers, a kitchen window with a view of a backyard that was hers. The first thing she did was stand at that window and touch the necklace and allow herself, for the first time in a long time, to feel the full weight of what she had done, the distance she had come from the bus stop in Orangeburg County, with Cora's hands at her throat. She raised Adeline in that house. She raised all 4 of her children in that house. And Adeline's earliest memory of her mother, her very first formed memory, the one that exists before language has fully arrived and lives instead as pure sensation, is Pearl in the morning light of that kitchen, the necklace gold against her dark throat, her hands moving through the familiar motions of breakfast, the locket catching the light in the particular way that it always caught morning light like something that had been waiting for it. Pearl wore the necklace through her heart diagnosis at 78, through 3 surgeries in 2 years, through the slow years of her 80s when her body began the long, gradual work of winding down while her mind remained as clear and precise as it had always been, through the years when she came to live with Adeline, and Adeline helped her in and out of chairs and made sure the clasp was fastened right each morning because Pearl's hands had lost some of their steadiness and the clasp required precision. On Pearl's last morning at 97 in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and the specific gray stillness of very early morning, Adeline sat in the chair beside her mother's bed and listened to the sound of Pearl breathing, change the way it changes when it is becoming something else, and she held Pearl's hand and said everything she needed to say while she still could. And when it was over, she sat for a while in the silence, and then carefully, with hands that were not entirely steady, she unfastened the clasp at the back of Pearl's neck and held the necklace in her palm. The chain coiled there, like something alive that was becoming something still. She put it on the next morning, and the morning after that, and every morning since. Not as a symbol, not as a statement, because it was Pearl's and Pearl was hers, and no distance, not the distance of death, not the distance of time, and certainly not the distance of a platinum-haired flight attendant with a manufactured policy and a closed fist, changes that. She was back in the cabin. Her fingers still wrapped around the locket, and the anger that moved through her was not the kind of anger that needs to make a sound. It had moved past heat some time ago, past the first flush of it when Brittany's hand closed around the chain, past the second wave of it, when she felt the clasp snap past whatever it was in those 3 seconds, before she stood up and had settled into something colder and cleaner and far more durable than heat, the kind of anger that doesn't yell and doesn't perform and doesn't require anyone to witness it to be real. The kind of anger that writes things down and makes calls and keeps records and does not forget. It was the kind of anger her mother had modeled for her across an entire lifetime, and she wore it the same way she wore Pearl's necklace, simply naturally as something that was hers. Zora had taken her hand without being asked. Her granddaughter's fingers were warm around hers, and Adeline squeezed them once without looking over, and Zora squeezed back. Eli had his head against her arm again, the specific weight of a 10-year-old who has processed as much as he can process and has decided that physical proximity to his grandmother is the correct response to the remainder of whatever is happening. His small cross necklace was still on his neck. Nobody had touched it. She was aware of this with a gratitude she did not express. The cabin around them had not returned to normal, and it would not. There was an activated quality to the air in the surrounding rows, the specific energized stillness of people who have witnessed something and know it, who are holding what they've seen with the particular carefulness of witnesses who understand their role. Harold, 2 rows back, had turned sideways in his seat and was looking at the front of the cabin with the patient, immovable quality he had been projecting since the first time he spoke. Dr. Wynne had not turned back to her books. The young woman with the phone had gone back to her seat, but her phone was in her hand, and her expression was the expression of someone who is not putting anything down. And 2 rows behind Adeline, Judge Raymond Osei was still writing. She could hear the careful scratch of his pen on the page in the spaces between engine noise, and she did not know yet who he was or what he was writing, but there was something in the rhythm of it, unhurried, deliberate, the pace of someone for whom every word carries weight that she found steadying in a way she couldn't entirely explain. Nadia called. "Mom." Her voice did the thing it did when she was holding herself very still. "What happened? I've been trying to call for 4 minutes." "She took the necklace off me," Adeline said. "By force. The chain is broken." The silence on Nadia's end lasted 1.5 seconds. "She what?" She reached over and took it. The clasp broke. Another silence, shorter and colder. Are you physically hurt? No. The children are shaken but fine. Is it on the recording? Adeline looked at the phone still running on her tray table. Every second of it. What came from Nadia then was not loud. It was the very specific, very controlled quiet of a woman who is a civil rights attorney and has been one for 20 years and understands in her body the weight of what her mother just said. Mom, she said. What that woman just did is not an airline policy violation. What she just did is criminal. I am no longer calling customer service. A breath. I'm calling James Achebe. Call him, Adeline said. She put the phone down. She looked at the broken necklace in her hand, the chain clean and gold, the damage precise, just the clasp, just the join, and she thought with the cold, clarifying clarity of someone who has decided what they are going to do, she was going to get this fixed. She was going to take it to the jeweler she knew in Charlotte. She was going to wear it to every deposition and every hearing and every day of whatever came next the same way Pearl wore it through everything this country put in her way. But first, the captain. The man in the early 40s, 2 rows forward Derek Okafor, had not spoken a single word since the flight departed Atlanta. He had sat with his jacket folded on the seat beside him and the particular focused stillness of someone who is on vacation and intends to remain that way, and he had watched the morning's events unfold from the corner of his eye with the involuntary professional attention of someone who cannot entirely turn off what he does for a living, even when he is trying to. He was a journalist. His byline appeared in 2 national publications. He was going home to New York from a week in Savannah that had been organized around doing absolutely nothing relevant to his career. He looked at his phone. He looked at the video he had recorded, all of it from the moment he understood what he was watching, which was approximately the 3rd minute of Brittany's first approach, which meant he had the full arc of the conversation, the recording announcement, the threatened removal, and he looked at the footage again, frame by frame, the grab. Clear. Undeniable. The kind of footage that speaks entirely for itself. He was no longer on vacation. He looked over the seat at Adeline. Mrs. Hayes, he said quietly. My name is Derek Okafor. I'm a journalist. I have video from the beginning. All of it. He paused. I want you to know before I do anything with it. Adeline looked at him steadily. She did not ask what he intended to do. She said, Thank you for telling me, and turned back to the front. Doctor. When appeared in the aisle beside row 12, she had stood and come back to them with the quiet directness of a woman who has decided that proximity communicates something important, and she placed a card on the tray table beside the phone. Her name, her department, the university, her direct office number. Constitutional law professor, New York University. 29 years, she said. I heard everything from the first approach. I will say exactly what I heard to anyone who asks in any room they need me to say it in. She went back to her seat. Harold leaned forward from 2 rows behind Adeline and rested his forearms on the seat back, the easy, large-handed posture of a man who has decided he is present for whatever comes next. You're not alone in this, he said. It was not a complicated statement. It did not require anything from her. It was simply true. And he said it the way true things can sometimes be said plainly, without performance, meaning every word. She looked at this collection of people, a professor, a journalist, a large, steady man who had simply decided to stand up when he saw something wrong, and a retired judge writing carefully in a leather notebook 2 rows behind her, and she felt something that she had not expected to feel on this plane on this morning. Not quite gratitude, though it contained gratitude. Something larger, the specific, startling feeling of a world that has surprised you by being better than you had prepared yourself for. She had spent her whole life being told she was on her own in rooms and on flights and in situations like this one. She had spent her whole life being surprised by the people who decided they weren't going to look away. She looked down at the necklace in her closed hand. She was going to get this fixed, and then she was going to wear it to everything that came next. The cockpit door opened and Captain Louis Ibarra stepped into the cabin, and the quality of his presence was immediately different from anything that had happened in the aisle in the last 40 minutes. Different from Brittany's aggressive forward lean and Stephen's anxious damage control energy. Different from the uncertain shuffle of people who are performing authority without genuine possession of it. He moved the way people move who have spent careers making decisions in high-stakes environments and have developed through that practice the particular economy of motion that comes from never wasting attention. Mid-50s, a trim build with the careful eyes of someone who reads rooms for a living. His name tag read, Captain Louis Ibarra, and he walked directly to row 12 without pausing at other rows, without scanning the cabin for the problem, because he already knew where the problem was. He had been briefed. Adeline could see this in the slight tightening around his eyes, in those first steps, the specific look of a man who has heard the shape of something, and is now measuring the actual thing against what he was told, and finding that they match in ways he had hoped they might not. He looked at Zora, at Eli, at Adeline's closed hand, and then at Adeline. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. His voice was measured and direct, the voice of someone who has learned that the most useful thing in a difficult moment is clarity. "My name is Captain Ibarra. I understand that an incident occurred in the cabin, and I would like to hear directly from you what happened." Adeline opened her hand. In her palm lay the broken necklace, the chain separated at the clasp, the break clean and small and irrefutable, the locket intact, the gold still warm from her skin. Captain Ibarra looked at it. His jaw moved once. The movement was involuntary, and he did not attempt to conceal it. "Your flight attendant," Adeline said in the same measured, unhurried register she had maintained through the entire morning, reached over and removed this from around my neck by force after I declined to give it to her voluntarily. The interaction was recorded in full from approximately the 3rd minute. "I have an attorney on the line. I have at least 4 witnesses in this cabin who have already identified themselves by name and indicated their willingness to provide statements. I have 2 grandchildren who watched every second of it." She paused. "I would like to know what you intend to do." Captain Ibarra was quiet for 4 seconds. Not the silence of someone choosing words to manage a situation, the silence of someone who is being honest with themselves about what they are looking at. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I want to begin by offering my personal apology." "I appreciate that," Adeline said. "But I didn't ask for an apology. I asked what you intend to do." Something shifted in his expression, not irritation, not defensiveness, but the specific thing that happens in a person's face when they are in the presence of someone who is exactly who they are and is not performing anything, and the unexpectedness of it produces a kind of respect that happens without permission. He looked at her steadily. "We will be returning to the gate," he said. Harold 2 rows back, exhaled a short, controlled breath that was not quite relief but was in its neighborhood. "Not to remove me," Adeline said. It was not a question. "No, ma'am, not to remove you." The cabin understood before he finished the sentence. People shifted, looked at each other, looked toward the back of the plane where Brittany had gone. And then, from the rear of the cabin came a series of sounds, a door, footsteps, the specific series of procedural movements that communicate that a decision has already been made, and what remains is only the mechanics of it. Brittany Cole did not walk past row 12 again. She did not collect her things in front of the passengers or stand in the aisle or make any visible departure. She moved through the back of the cabin with the quiet, careful efficiency of someone being escorted through a process that has already concluded, and her absence settled over the rows the way facts settle simply without drama as something that is now true. The cabin did not erupt. There was no moment of celebration or outburst or collective noise. There was simply the specific texture of Brittany Cole no longer being present in the space she had occupied for the last hour, and the particular way that absence reorganized the air of the cabin into something that felt, for the first time in that flight, like it might be breathable. Eli looked up at his grandmother. "Grandma," he said, "is she gone?" Adeline looked toward the front of the cabin where Captain Ibarra was speaking quietly into the intercom handset, and then she looked at her grandson. "Yes, baby," she said. "She's gone." Eli considered this for a moment with the careful seriousness of a 10-year-old processing a conclusion. Then he nodded once firmly with the decisive quality of someone who has satisfied himself that the situation has been properly resolved, and he put his head back against his grandmother's arm. 2 rows behind them, Judge Raymond Osei capped his pen. He had filled 4 pages of his leather notepad in the small, precise handwriting of a man who has spent nearly 3 decades understanding that what is written down matters more than what is merely witnessed. He looked out the window at the clouds below, and his expression was not satisfaction. It was something quieter and more considered than that, the expression of someone who has done what they came to do, without anyone asking them to, and finds that sufficient. Adeline held the broken necklace. She held it the way she had held it since Brittany's hand opened in her closed palm, warm present. The locket still carried the photograph. The chain was broken at the clasp and nowhere else. Everything else was intact. She thought about Pearl. The plane had leveled back toward the gate, and the cabin had achieved the particular exhausted stillness of a space where something significant has happened, and everyone in it is quietly processing what they are now carrying when Adeline's phone buzzed with an Atlanta area code she didn't recognize. She looked at it for a moment. She answered. Mrs. Hayes. The voice was a woman's, older, careful, with the specific cadence of someone who has been rehearsing what she intends to say and has arrived at the beginning of it, and is not entirely sure she is ready to be there. "My name is Claudette Morrison. I was on your flight today. Row 22. Adeline said nothing. She waited with the patience of someone who has learned that waiting is sometimes the most useful thing you can offer a person who is trying to say something difficult. "I didn't say anything," Claudette said. "I want you to know that I called because I've been sitting with that since it happened. I saw it. I was watching from my seat, and I saw all of it, and I didn't say anything." Adeline let that sit. "My daughter sent me the video," Claudette continued, and her voice had developed a slight wobble in it, the kind that comes not from weakness, but from honesty. It was already online before the plane finished taxiing back. "She called me, she was very upset, and she asked me what I did." A pause. I didn't have an answer for her. Adeline thought about this carefully, the way she thought about things she wanted to understand before she responded to them. She thought about all the rows of passengers on that flight, the ones who had spoken, the ones who had filmed, the ones who had stayed in their seats and looked at their phones and told themselves it was not their place, the ones who had the calculation in their heads that kept them from doing the thing they would later wish they had done. She understood that calculation. She had seen it operate for 74 years. She did not think it made people bad. She thought it made them human, which was its own kind of complicated. "Do you have children?" Adeline asked. Claudette seemed surprised by the question. 3, and 4 grandchildren. "Then let me ask you something," Adeline said. "If it had been you in row 12 this morning, if it had been your grandchildren with you, would you have wanted someone in row 22 to say something?" The silence that followed was long enough to be genuine. "Yes," Claudette said quietly. "I would have." "Then you know," Adeline said, "what you're going to do differently next time." Another silence, not heavy this time, something lighter and harder to name the specific silence of a person who has received something they needed to receive and is trying to find the right place for it. "Thank you," Claudette said. "Don't thank me," Adeline said. "Just do it next time." She hung up. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand and thought about how many Claudettes there had been over the years, How many people in row 22 who had watched and calculated and stayed quiet? How many next times that had come and gone without the lesson landing? How many of them had gone home that evening and called their daughters and not had answers? She hoped this one would be different. She suspected it would be for Claudette Morrison specifically. Some lessons land, some don't. You can't always know which kind you're giving while you're giving it. The pilot's voice came over the intercom with the announcement of initial descent, and Adeline used the remaining minutes in the air the way she used everything carefully without waste. She had 3 voicemails from news networks she had not listened to, 11 text messages, and 2 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Calvin had texted 4 times in increasing urgency, the last message reading simply, "I am calling." "Pick up." She texted him back, "I will call when we land. Do not threaten anyone." She could feel his energy from Atlanta. Nadia called at the beginning of the descent, and her voice had the specific quality of someone who has been working for the last hour and has found something. "Mom, I need to tell you what I found before you land." "Tell me." Brittany Cole has been formally complained about before. 2 prior complaints in the last 3 years, both filed through Delta's official channels, both filed by black passengers, and both marked in Delta's internal records as resolved internally. She let that phrase sit for a moment, resolved internally with the weight of what it actually meant. The first was a woman named Denise Price, a physical therapist from Charlotte, 2022. Brittany told her that a medical alert bracelet was a safety hazard and demanded she remove it mid-flight. Delta's response was a form letter and a $75 flight credit. Adeline was quiet. The second was a family from Washington, D.C., 2023. Brittany told the grandmother that her adult daughter's gold earrings were a distraction to other passengers and demanded they be removed. The grandmother filed a formal complaint, kept every email, and received a form letter. Her name is Ruth Annan Bridges. She is a retired school counselor, and she kept her paperwork in a folder in a desk drawer for 2 years, Mom. 2 years. Because she refused to pretend it hadn't happened. Adeline closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. This was not about Brittany Cole anymore. It had not been about Brittany Cole for some time, if it had ever truly been only about Brittany Cole. This was about what Delta knew, and when they knew it, and what they decided to do with that knowledge, which was to send a form letter and clear her for the next flight and the next cabin and the next row where she would stop and look at a black woman's jewelry and make a decision before a word was exchanged. "Find them," Adeline said. "Both of them." "Already working it," Nadia said. James Achebe's team is also pulling Delta's complaint records under a preservation letter. Mom, if there are 2 we know about, there may be more. How many more we don't know yet. But James is already talking about filing a joint complaint if we can confirm the pattern. Not 3 separate incidents, a documented history of discriminatory conduct. That is a fundamentally different legal situation for Delta. The plane descended. New York came up below them, the gray, enormous city, indifferent and full of everything. Adeline held the broken necklace in her closed hand. She thought about Pearl's words on the bus stop in Orangeburg County. "You come from people who endured." She thought about Denise Price and her $75 voucher. She thought about Ruth Annan Bridges keeping a folder in a drawer for 2 years on the faith that the truth of what she experienced would one day matter in a room large enough to hold it. She thought it matters now. The wheels found the runway. Harold leaned forward from 2 rows behind her, 10 minutes before they landed, in the easy way of a man who has decided he is allowed to be present for the conclusion of something he was part of from the beginning. "You doing all right up there?" "Getting there," Adeline said. "The man behind you?" Harold said with a small nod toward the row further back, "has been writing in a notebook since the captain left. Hasn't stopped." Adeline turned. Judge Raymond Osei looked up from the piece of paper he had just folded with the unhurried timing of someone who was expecting to be looked at and was prepared for it. He was 63 years old with the kind of face that has spent decades at a level of attention that leaves a specific mark on a person, a quality of presence of being fully in a room that is not quite severity but is related to it. He was wearing a dark suit that had been good since the morning and was still good, and his hands on the folded paper were large and steady. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. "My name is Raymond Osei. I'm a retired United States District Court Judge, Southern District of New York. 28 years on the federal bench." He paused. "I was seated directly behind you." Adeline looked at him. "I was in Atlanta for a judicial ethics conference," he continued, "and I requested this specific window seat for this specific row, because the afternoon light through these windows is the only thing that makes reading on airplanes tolerable, which I realize is a very small fact to be relevant to a situation of this size. But there it is." He said this with the particular dryness of a man who has spent his career being precise about the difference between relevant and irrelevant and knows exactly where the line is. "I heard everything from the beginning. I saw everything." He held out the folded piece of paper. Adeline took it and opened it. It was a statement handwritten in a small, precise hand on notepad paper. 4 paragraphs. The events of the morning in chronological order, times noted with reference to the flight clock visible from his seat, signed at the bottom, with his full name and credentials, the Honorable Raymond A. Osei, U.S. District Court, retired, Southern District of New York. She read it once. She looked up. "I have already transmitted a copy," he said, "to the FAA's Passenger Rights Division and to the office of James Achebe, which I found in under a minute, because James Achebe is not unknown in federal civil rights practice. This was at approximately 9:58 while we were still at altitude." He looked at her steadily. "I handled what I could handle from my seat." Adeline held the statement. She thought about this man sitting 2 rows behind her for the last hour and a half, filling 4 pages in careful handwriting, sending them to the right places without announcement, without being asked, without requiring acknowledgement, simply doing what the situation required of a person who had the tools to do it. Why, she said, not skeptically, genuinely. "Because this is what it looks like when people do what they're supposed to do," he said. "It shouldn't be exceptional. It should be ordinary." A brief pause. "I'll be there when you need me. In writing in person wherever this goes." The plane touched down. The jetway connected with a soft, mechanical sound, and the cabin door opened, and the world outside the plane asserted itself. The specific noise of an airport terminal, the smells, the scale, the sudden reminder that the self-contained world of the cabin was always only temporary, and Adeline walked off the plane with her granddaughter on one side and her grandson on the other, and the broken necklace still in her closed hand. 3 news crews were positioned at the exit. Not a wall of cameras, not a press conference set up, just 3 local affiliates arranged with the specific preparedness of people who have been tipped off that this exit at this time is where the story is coming through. Derek Okafor's work, possibly. Calvin's, possibly both. Nadia was at the gate, not on her phone, not on her laptop, not in motion. Just there, standing 20 feet from the exit with both arms already open, and the specific expression of a woman who has been preparing herself for this moment for the last 2 hours and is still not entirely prepared. The reunion was not quiet or small. Nadia held her mother, and then Zora was there, and Eli threw himself at his aunt's knees, and for a moment all 4 of them were tangled together in the middle of the arrivals hall. A knot of family that had just come through something while the airport moved around them with its rolling bags and its Tuesday urgencies, and its complete indifference to the significance of what it was witnessing. Then Nadia pulled back and looked at her mother's face with the specific attention of a daughter rather than an attorney. "Are you hurt?" "No," Adeline said. "The necklace." Adeline opened her purse and showed her. Nadia looked at the broken chain in her mother's palm, and her jaw tightened in the way it tightened when she was holding something in, and then she looked at her mother, and something passed between them that did not require language, the specific communication of a woman and her daughter who have both loved the same person their whole lives. And that person is gone now, and what's left needs protecting. Calvin materialized at Adeline's side, 71 years old, and vibrating with the specific frequency of a man who has been making calls for 2 hours and has not yet been able to do enough. He said her name across the 6 feet between them with more grief in it than fury, which was how she knew he had seen the video. She took his hand without looking at him, and he went quiet immediately and held on. Dr. Wynne came through the gate behind them and appeared at Adeline's elbow with the directness of a woman who has decided that proximity is action. She placed a card in Adeline's hand, Name Department University Direct Line. Constitutional law. I heard everything from the first approach. I will say exactly what I heard in any room you need me to say it in. She walked on without ceremony. Harold came through and shook Adeline's hand with both of his, the warm, firm handshake of a man who does not require anything in return for what he did and is not going to make it complicated. 300 flights, he said. Never said a word to another passenger. Don't regret saying it today. What do you do? Adeline asked. Retired, he said. State appellate court clerk. 34 years. He met her eyes. I know what good records look like. You have them. He walked on. Adeline looked at the card in her hand, at the broken necklace in her purse, at Nadia, already back on her phone coordinating 3 things simultaneously, at Calvin, who was radiating the particular energy of a man who has been told to wait and is doing it badly. She looked at Zora, who was standing very close to her grandmother's left shoulder and had been for the last 10 minutes. Ready? Adeline asked her. Zora looked at the cameras. Are you? Yes, Adeline said. And she was. She thought about Dorothy, about Pearl, whose name had been Dorothy to no one who had been Pearl, to everyone who had come from a bus stop in Orangeburg County with a gold chain at her throat and built a life of such quiet density that the weight of it was still being felt 3 generations later in the hand of a woman who simply refused to take the necklace off. She thought about Denise Price and a $75 voucher. She thought about Ruth Ann Bridges keeping a folder in a desk drawer in Memphis for 2 full years alone on the specific faith that the truth of her experience would one day matter in a room large enough to hold it. She thought about what it had cost both of those women to file a complaint and receive a form letter and understand in that moment exactly what the institution had decided their experience was worth. She walked toward the cameras. Nadia caught up beside her in 2 steps. Mom, you don't have to do this right now. Yes, Adeline said I do. She stopped in front of the first reporter, a young woman, maybe 26, with a microphone and the nervous, forward-leaning energy of someone covering her first genuinely significant story. And she looked at the camera with the steady, complete attention of someone who is not performing for it, but simply speaking to what is behind it. I was sitting with my grandchildren, she said, and her voice was clear enough to carry without effort. Wearing my late mother's necklace she passed 7 months ago. A flight attendant demanded I remove it. I declined. She reached over and took it off my neck by force and broke the chain. She opened her purse and held up the broken necklace so the camera could see it. The chain separated at the clasp, the locket intact, and she held it there for 3 seconds without saying anything because some things are sufficiently clear when you can see them. What do you want to see happen as a result of today? The reporter asked. I want Brittany Cole terminated, Adeline said simply and without heat. I want Delta Airlines to conduct a genuine, transparent review of every complaint that has been filed against cabin crew and buried without investigation, not managed, not resolved internally, actually reviewed. I want Denise Price, a physical therapist from Charlotte, who filed a complaint against this same flight attendant in 2022 and received a $75 voucher to receive the investigation her complaint deserved 2 years ago. I want Ruth Annan Bridges, a retired school counselor who kept her complaint paperwork in a drawer in Memphis for 2 years because she refused to pretend it hadn't happened to receive the same. She paused. And I want my grandchildren. She was aware of Zora standing just behind her left shoulder, close enough to touch, who watched all of this morning. To understand that you do not have to accept being treated this way, that your family's history, your mother's jewelry, none of it is subject to someone else's authority to remove. She turned away before anyone could ask another question. Nadia stepped into the space she had vacated, and Calvin appeared at Adeline's right side, and she took his arm, and they walked through the glass doors and into the New York air. Zora came beside her. They stood for a moment on the sidewalk. Grandma Zora said, "Who is Denise Price?" "A woman who tried to do what was right and got ignored," Adeline said. "Until today." Zora was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you meant on the plane, about it not being finished just for us?" "That's exactly what I meant," Adeline said. The conference call was at 3 in the afternoon from Nadia's apartment with the laptop open on the kitchen table that had served as a war room on more than one previous occasion, and was clearly comfortable in that role. Nadia had set out water and a notepad and 2 pens without asking, and she had a second call running simultaneously on her phone with an NAACP regional director named Patricia Antwi, who had been in contact since 11 that morning and had offered the organization's national legal team at no cost to Adeline should she choose to pursue formal action. James Akibe's voice arrived on the conference line with the calm, anchoring quality of a man who has spent 24 years in exactly these situations and has developed the specific steadiness that comes from knowing how to orient yourself when everything around you is in motion. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, addressing Adeline directly, which she noted as the right choice. "I want to begin by telling you what I have reviewed. I have listened to your recording twice in full. I have watched both videos, yours and Derek Okafor's. I have read Judge Osei's statement. I have reviewed Captain Ibarra's official incident report, which Delta's legal department transmitted to my office this afternoon under the preservation letter we filed this morning." A brief pause. "This is one of the most completely documented passenger civil rights violations I have encountered in over 2 decades of practice." "What does that mean in practical terms?" Adeline asked. "It means that what Brittany Cole did constitutes battery under New York state law physical contact that was harmful, offensive, and made without consent. It also gives us a strong foundation for a federal civil rights claim which covers racial discrimination in the enforcement of contracts, including airline passenger contracts. And it means that Delta's history of receiving complaints about this specific employee and choosing inaction creates what we call institutional liability. They cannot claim they didn't know. They knew. They chose to do nothing. 3 times. He paused. Except Nadia said it isn't 3 times. She had found more. James's team, working through Delta's own records under the preservation letter, had identified 5 prior complaints against Brittany Cole, not 2, not 3, but 5 over 4 years. 4 of them from Black or Latino passengers. 3 of those closed without any documented investigation whatsoever. 5 was a different number from 3. 5 was not a troubled employee who had slipped through a gap in oversight. 5 was a decision made repeatedly by people with the authority to stop it, who had looked at what they were looking at and stamped resolved and moved on to the next item. Denise Price was confirmed. James's team had reached her, and she was ready, she said, with the specific readiness of a woman who had been holding $75 worth of airline credit for 2 years and understood precisely what it represented. Ruth Annan Bridges was confirmed her attorney, Sylvia Grant, who had a Memphis number and the voice of someone who had been waiting patiently for exactly this alignment of circumstances, confirmed that Ruth had her folder, her emails, her dates, her seat numbers, and that she had kept them not because she was certain anything would come of it, but because she refused to pretend the thing that had happened to her had not happened. "We file a joint civil complaint," James said. All three complainants together. Not three separate incidents, a documented pattern of discriminatory conduct. That is a fundamentally different legal and public situation. When Adeline asked. "Friday," he said, "while the pressure is exactly where it needs to be. I want to be honest with you about what that means. Your name and Denise's name and Ruth's name will be in every major newspaper within 24 hours of filing." "They're already there," Adeline said. Then Friday, James confirmed. The weight of 5 families, 5 complaints, 5 sets of people who had tried to tell the truth and had been handed a form letter and cleared back out into the world settled into the kitchen. Adeline picked up her pen. She wrote 5 on the notepad in front of her and looked at it. Not 3. 5. She thought about Pearl, who had been called only Pearl for 11 years by people whose children she raised and who had never once stopped being exactly who she was underneath the name they chose for her. She thought about Ruth Ann Bridges keeping a folder in a drawer for 2 years on Faith. Friday, Adeline said. That evening, Delta's CEO, Thomas Harrington, released a video statement, not a press release, not a corporate communication filtered through legal and PR and 5 layers of institutional language, but a video recorded in what appeared to be his office, no tie looking directly into the camera with the expression of a man who has watched something and felt it, actually felt it in the way that bypasses the professional layer and arrives at the person underneath. Nadia turned her laptop toward Adeline and pressed play. What Harrington said was not the language of managed crisis communication. He said what happened to Mrs. Adeline Hayes and her grandchildren on this flight is not a policy failure and is not a training failure. It is a moral failure, and it happened on our watch to a passenger who was traveling with her family and wearing her late mother's necklace and doing nothing wrong. He said Brittany Cole had been terminated permanently, not pending any review, but permanently effective immediately. And then he said the thing that his legal team had almost certainly advised him not to say. He said Delta also failed Mrs. Hayes in 2022 and in 2023 when passengers brought complaints to us about this same crew member that we should have taken seriously and did not. I am ordering an immediate and complete review of every passenger complaint filed against any cabin crew member in the last 5 years. Every complaint. Every single one. He looked into the camera one final time and said, "Mrs. Hayes, if you are watching this, I am sorry. And I mean that as a human being, not as the CEO of an airline." The video ended. Nadia and Adeline sat with it for a moment. He said 2022 and 2023, Nadia said slowly. He did not have to say that. His legal team almost certainly told him it was an admission of prior knowledge. But he said it. Adeline said. He said it. Nadia looked at her mother. "James says it actually strengthens our position, but I don't think he said it for legal strategy." Adeline looked at the frozen image of Thomas Harrington on the laptop screen. "Good," she said. "Then we'll hold him to it." An hour later, a text arrived from Derek Okafor to Nadia's phone, 3 words before a link. "You need this." Nadia opened it, read it, and her face moved through 3 separate expressions in approximately 4 seconds. Shock, then understanding, then a slow, cold fury that settled into something very still. She handed the phone to Adeline without speaking. It was an article Derek had written from his reporting that afternoon. He had found Brittany Cole's social media history, a private account, the kind that people maintain under the assumption that privacy means invisibility. Screenshots provided by a former colleague of Brittany's who had watched the news that morning and made a decision about what to do with what she knew. The posts went back 4 years. They were not ambiguous. They were the specific, unguarded language of someone who believed they were speaking in a room no one was watching, the kind of language that confirms what the body already knew from the moment Brittany's eyes went to Pearl's necklace during the pre-departure walkthrough and made a decision before a single word had been exchanged. Adeline read it once, She put the phone down. She came to work that morning already carrying this, Nadia said, her voice very controlled. The necklace wasn't the cause. It was the occasion. She looked at my grandchildren, Adeline said. Yes. She looked at us, and she decided. Yes. The room was quiet. Adeline thought about Eli asleep against her arm, his small cross on its chain. She thought about Zora's bracelet catching the morning light in the Charlotte kitchen. She thought about what Brittany Cole had seen when she paused at row 12 during the pre-departure walk, and what she had decided in that half-second before she moved on. "Send it to James," Adeline said. "Already sent while you were reading," Nadia said. Calvin arrived at Nadia's apartment at 6:30, with the particular energy of a man who has spent the entire day being told to wait by people he loves and has reached the limit of what waiting can hold. He was 71 years old and had the same eyes as Pearl, which Adeline had always found both a comfort and a periodic surprise, and he walked through the door and looked at his sister for a long moment before he said anything at all. "Show me," he said. She showed him the necklace, the broken chain, the clasp, the locket intact. He held it in his large hands and was very quiet for a moment, in the way that certain kinds of grief require the grief that knows itself as grief and does not try to be anything else. "Mama would have been on the first flight," he said finally. "I know she would have. She would have walked straight to corporate." "I know." He handed the necklace back. His jaw was tight. "What do you need me to do?" "Right now," Adeline said. "I need you to take these children somewhere and get them dinner. They've been on their feet since before 6 this morning, and they've seen enough today." Eli was in the kitchen with a bowl of cereal, having transitioned from the morning's considerable drama into snacks with the complete and enviable equanimity of a 10-year-old for whom the conclusion of a crisis is primarily an occasion for food. Zora was at the table with her grandmother's notepad writing something private in the careful way of a person processing something that requires more than just being thought. Calvin put his hand on the back of Adeline's head, the specific touch of an older brother, the one he had been using his whole life to ask if his sister was still there without requiring her to answer in words. "You good," he said quietly. "Getting there," she said. He nodded. He called the children. They went. Nadia waited until the door closed and then sat down across from her mother at the kitchen table with both elbows on the surface and her hands folded under her chin in the posture she used when she was thinking seriously about something and needed to not be on her phone for a moment. "The 4th and 5th complainants," she said. "James's team is working to identify them from Delta's records. If they're willing, give them the option," Adeline said. "No pressure on anyone who's not ready. But give them the option." She looked at her daughter. "Nobody should do this alone." Nadia looked at her mother for a long moment. "You know this is going to take a while," she said. "Months, maybe more. They're going to look into everything about you, your finances, your history, everything." Adeline looked at her daughter with the patient, clear regard of a woman who has been many things in this country and has not been broken by any of them. "Nadia," she said, "I grew up in Greenville, South Carolina in the 1950s. I have been audited and questioned and dismissed more times than I can accurately count. A team of corporate attorneys reviewing my credit history is not going to be the hardest thing I have faced." She paused. "Not even close." Nadia's eyes went bright for a moment. She pressed them, steady, nodded once. "Okay," she said. "Okay, Mom." She picked up her phone. "Then let's get to work." The call came at 8:15 in the evening from a Memphis number, and the woman on the other end had the voice of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and is finally arriving at the place where she can set it down somewhere it will actually be used. "Mrs. Hayes," she said. "My name is Ruth Annan Bridges. I believe your daughter's office has been trying to reach me. They have, Adeline said. I'm glad you called. I saw the news this morning, Ruth said. I'd been watching since my daughter called me at 9 a.m. and told me to turn on the television, and I called Delta directly before anyone from your team reached me. I called them myself at 9:15 this morning, before I even knew who your daughter was or who your attorney was, because I had been waiting for 2 years for a conversation like this, and I was not going to wait another hour. She paused. I had my folder ready. Her story came out steadily in the measured way of a woman who has told it to herself many times in the privacy of her own home, and knows exactly which parts matter. 2023 a flight with her 2 adult daughters. Brittany Cole approaching their row with the same performance of pleasant authority, telling the younger daughter, 26 years old, wearing small gold hoops she had owned since college, that the earrings were a distraction to other passengers in first class and would need to be removed. A distraction, Ruth said, and the word landed the way it was meant to land, with its full weight visible. Not a safety concern. A distraction to other passengers. My daughter asked her to explain what that meant, and she couldn't explain it because there is no explanation for it. There is only what it is. Delta's response had been a form letter. 3 sentences of corporate language that resolved into, "We have reviewed your concern, and it has been addressed." A signature from someone in customer relations. No name for whom it had been addressed with. No description of what addressing it had involved. And at the bottom, in the specific language of institutional condescension, "We hope to see you on a future Delta flight." I kept the letter, Ruth said. I kept every email. I kept the seat numbers and the flight number and the names I had written down on the back of my boarding pass while we were still in the air. I kept all of it in a manila envelope in my desk for 2 years. She paused. People ask me why I kept it when nothing was going to happen, but I never believed nothing was going to happen. I believed that one day it was going to matter in a room large enough to hold it. I just didn't know when. Adeline felt something move through her that was physical, a specific interior shift, the weight of recognition. 2 women who had never met and had never known each other existed, a 74-year-old hospital administrator in Charlotte and a retired school counselor in Memphis, and between them a 2-year gap that had been held open by one woman's refusal to pretend her experience hadn't happened, kept alive by a manila envelope in a desk drawer, waiting. Your attorney, Sylvia Grant Adeline, said. I hired her in 2023. Ruth said the week after Delta sent me that letter. She told me then what she tells me now, that we had the truth. That truth eventually becomes evidence, and that timing is the one thing you cannot control. So we waited. A beat. We're done waiting. We file Friday, Adeline said. All 3 of us together. Joint complaint documented pattern. You, me, and Denise Price. I know, Ruth said. Sylvia called James Achebe this afternoon. They've already spoken twice. Are you ready? There was a pause that had no uncertainty in it. Only weight, the weight of 2 years and a manila envelope, and a conviction that had never softened, even when it had no evidence of being correct. Mrs. Hayes, Ruth Annan Bridges, said, I have been ready since the day I put those papers in that drawer. Adeline sat for a moment after the call ended, holding the phone in her lap in the specific quiet of someone who has just spoken to a person they did not know existed this morning, and whose existence has clarified something she did not know needed clarifying. She thought about Pearl. She thought about Cora Pearl's mother pressing a gold chain into her daughter's hands on a bus stop and saying, "You come from people who endured." She thought so does Ruth Annan Bridges. So does Denise Price. So do all the families whose names James's team had not yet confirmed but would. She picked up the notepad. She started writing down what she needed to remember. Friday morning was clear and cold in New York, the kind of morning that feels like a declaration. And Adeline stood at her bedroom mirror in Charlotte. She had flown back Wednesday evening because she needed her own house around her for 2 nights. Needed the familiar weight of the rooms Pearl had visited, and the kitchen where she had her own coffee and the specific comfort of the ordinary, and she fastened Pearl's necklace. The clasp was new. The jeweler, the one she had taken it to Thursday morning, the son of the man she had trusted for 20 years with his father's precise hands and his father's understanding of what he was handling, had worked for 20 minutes while Adeline sat in the chair beside his workbench and watched. The repair was seamless. The chain was whole. If you looked closely, very closely, you could see the faint seam where the new clasp met the old gold, the mark of a join, but you had to be looking for it. She checked the locket. The photograph was undamaged. Pearl, young and unsmiling in the way of photographs from that era, looking directly into the camera with the specific quality of someone who has decided the camera is going to see exactly what she chooses to show it, no more and no less. She fastened the necklace, and the locket settled against her chest where it had always belonged. The courthouse steps were reached by 11, and Denise Price was already there. A compact woman in her early 50s with the specific kind of calm that comes from having been angry for 2 years and having found at the bottom of the anger something clear and purposeful. She held out her hand, and Adeline took it, and they stood for a moment without speaking because there was a conversation between them that had been going on for 2 years without either of them knowing the other existed, and this was only the first moment they were meeting the other side of it in person. Ruth Ann Bridges arrived 3 minutes later with Sylvia Grant, and when she came up the courthouse steps and saw Adeline, she stopped for one beat, a pause of recognition, the specific pause of 2 people who have experienced the same shape of thing and see it in each other's face without needing to describe it. And then she continued up the steps, and they embraced briefly, and neither of them needed to say what the embrace was for. Ruth produced her folder from her carry-on. It was a standard manila envelope thicker than it looked, with a strip of masking tape across the top on which she had written in careful handwriting Delta/Bridges/2023. She opened it on the courthouse steps and showed Adeline the contents, every email printed and organized by date, the boarding passes she had saved from that flight, the names she had written on the back of her own pass while still in the air, because she knew even then that names were going to matter, and the form letter at the front, which she had kept not as evidence, but as a reminder, she said, of what she had been told her experience was worth. Denise Price reached into her bag and produced a piece of paper, a flight credit voucher from Delta Airlines dated 2022 for $75, made out in her name. She had not used it. She had not destroyed it. Same reason, she said simply. James Achebe filed the joint complaint at 11:47. The language was precise and specific, and had the particular weight of something that has been built carefully over several days by people who understand what they are building and why the architecture matters. Pattern of discriminatory conduct, institutional liability, battery, civil rights violation, not 3 isolated incidents, but a documented history of conduct that had been reported, received, and buried 3 times formally and twice more informally over 4 years, with the specific effect of sending its perpetrator back out into another cabin to find another row. On the courthouse steps, Adeline spoke to the cameras briefly. She said what she had come to say, that this was not finished with the filing, that justice was a process, rather than a moment, that Denise and Ruth deserved the investigation that had been owed to them for years, and that if the 4th and 5th families whose complaints were in Delta's records were watching, they did not have to do this alone. Then she walked back inside, and Nadia was behind her, and Ruth was beside her, and Denise was on her other side. Zora was there. She had asked to come, and she had been brought, and she stood at the top of the steps after the cameras had turned away and looked out at the city for a long moment with the expression of a 13-year-old who is assembling something she will be carrying for a very long time. The weeks after the filing moved the way these things move when they have enough documented weight behind them to keep moving even when the people who preferred they stop. applied pressure with the specific grinding, unstoppable momentum of truth that has been organized into evidence. The Department of Transportation opened a formal review within 10 days. The congressional inquiry followed, accelerated by the fact that 2 committee members had already made public statements, and a third had cited Ruth Ann Bridges' case specifically on the floor. Delta's internal complaint records compelled by investigators revealed not 5 prior complaints against Brittany Cole, but 7 complaints over 4 years, 4 from Black or Latino passengers. 3 closed with no documented investigation, marked with the specific institutional language that meant we received this and decided it was not going to cost us more to ignore than to address. 7 was not a troubled employee. 7 was a decision made repeatedly by people with the authority to make a different one. The 4th family was identified through Delta's own records, a couple from Houston, 2021, who had filed a complaint about Brittany's differential treatment during a transatlantic flight and had received they had kept it. They confirmed a form letter and a $100 flight credit. They were reached by James's team on a Thursday afternoon, and by Friday morning they had said yes. The 5th was identified through Derek Okafor's reporting a woman traveling alone from Miami in 2020, a nurse named Yvonne Sarpong, who had been told her stethoscope chain was a prohibited item, and who had filed with Delta and then with the FAA, and who had received from both polite and procedural non-answers that she had kept in a folder on the same faith Ruth had kept hers. She called Sylvia Grant's office before Sylvia called her. Brittany Cole's FAA certification was placed under formal review. Her attorney's public statement was carefully worded in the specific way of someone who has seen the social media screenshots and the 5-year complaint record and understands the weight of what they are working with. Stephen Marsh gave a written statement to investigators unsolicited, in which he confirmed that he had understood something was wrong when Brittany returned to row 12 the second time, that he had not acted quickly enough, and that he would say so in any room and in any document that required it. No self-exoneration, no qualification, no request for anything in return. He simply told the truth. Judge Raymond Osei's statement, those 4 pages of careful handwriting from the altitude of 37,000 feet, entered the congressional record in full. He was invited to testify. He testified without notes from 28 years of accumulated precision, and what he said in that hearing room was reported in 14 national publications. Dr. Patricia Wynn published a piece in the Columbia Law Review about the gap between captains' discretionary authority and FAA passenger rights protections. The exact regulatory distinction she had clarified from her seat on the plane, and the piece was cited in 2 of the legislative proposals that followed. Harold came to the congressional hearing. He sat in the public gallery and watched with the patient, steady quality he had carried through the entire morning in row 12, and afterward he shook Adeline's hand again and told her he didn't regret saying something every day since the day he said it, and she believed him completely. Claudette Morrison sent Nadia an email 6 weeks after the flight. She had been on a plane that month, she wrote, and had witnessed a flight attendant speaking dismissively to an elderly woman, ignoring her requests, rolling her eyes when the woman's English was imperfect. Claudette had spoken up. She had kept speaking up until the flight attendant changed her behavior. She was writing to say so, not because she wanted recognition, but because she had told someone she would do it next time, and she had, and she wanted them to know. Nadia showed Adeline the email. Adeline read it twice. She did not respond with celebration or with a lecture about what it meant. She simply nodded and said, "Good," because that was what it was. Good. Not extraordinary. Not the thing it shouldn't have had to be. Just good, which was all it had ever needed to be, which was what it always should have been. 4 months after the filing, on a Tuesday in October, Adeline sat in James Achebe's conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, with Nadia on her left, and Ruth Ann Bridges across from her, and Denise Price beside Ruth and Sylvia Grant at the end of the table, and James placed a document in front of each of them, and gave them time to read it. The settlement terms were extensive. The financial components were not disclosed publicly as is standard. But the public elements were what mattered, and the public elements were specific and binding, and had been negotiated with the precision of people who understood that a check without structure is not accountability. Delta Airlines would issue a formal public apology, not a statement, not a prepared remark by a communications officer, but a formal public apology signed by the CEO and published in full naming, Adeline Hayes, Denise Price, and Ruth Annan Bridges by name, acknowledging specifically what had happened to each of them and what the airline had failed to do when each of them had reported it. Delta would undergo a comprehensive independent review of all passenger complaint records for the previous 6 years, conducted by an outside civil rights organization with public reporting requirements. Mandatory retraining for all cabin crew would be implemented with annual requirements thereafter, not based on internal curriculum but developed in partnership with civil rights organizations including the NAACP. An independent passenger ombudsman position would be established, a standing role with genuine investigative authority to which any passenger could report a complaint and receive a substantive response from a person whose job was to take the complaint seriously. And the last item on the list, the one James had placed at the end, deliberately a foundation, would be established and funded in Pearl Hayes's name to provide civil rights legal assistance to air passengers who have experienced discrimination and cannot afford private counsel. Adeline looked at that line for a long time. She thought about Pearl on the bus stop in Orangeburg County at 18, with Cora's hands at her throat and a gold chain being pressed into her hands, and the weight of everything that chain had already survived before Adeline was born. She thought about Pearl standing at the kitchen window in the house she had bought with her own money, touching the necklace, allowing herself to feel the distance she had come. She thought about Pearl at 97, in the hospital bed, the chain still there, still hers, and Adeline's hands careful at the clasp on the last morning. She thought about what Pearl would say in this conference room in front of this document. Not a speech, not something formal, something plain and direct the way Pearl said everything that mattered. Something like, well, it took long enough. Will the foundation actually help people? She asked. That, James said, depends entirely on how it is run, which is why we negotiated that you sit on the advisory board. Adeline looked at him. Does Ruth know Ruth is also on the board? Nadia said. And Denise. All three of you together. She looked across the table at Ruth Annan Bridges, who was looking back at her with the expression of someone who has been carrying a manila envelope for 2 years on faith, and has just watched that faith become something real and solid and lasting in front of her eyes. Ruth nodded once, a simple, certain nod, the nod of a woman who knew what she was agreeing to and had no hesitation about agreeing to it. And Denise Price, who had said almost nothing during the meeting, and who had been turning her $75 voucher over in her hands since they sat down, the voucher she had kept for 2 years, not as evidence but as a reminder, set it on the table in front of her and smoothed it flat with her palm and left it there. Adeline looked at the 3 women at that table. She looked at what they had made between them, starting from 3 separate form letters and 3 separate drawers in 3 separate cities where 3 separate women had decided they were not going to pretend their experiences hadn't happened. She looked at the foundation named for a woman who had worn a gold chain through 73 years of this country's full complexity and had never once been asked for permission to keep wearing it. She picked up her pen. She signed. On the first morning, the Pearl Hayes Civil Rights Travel Fund opened its intake line. Adeline was in her Charlotte kitchen finishing her coffee, the early light coming through the window the same way it had always come through the window, and she picked up the necklace from the small dish on the counter and turned it in the light. For a moment, the clasp new and smooth, the seam visible. If you looked closely, the locket warm already from the sun, and she fastened it, and the locket settled against her chest. She thought not about the courthouse or the settlement or the cameras or any of it. She thought about Pearl's hands and the way they had always smelled of the gardenia soap she kept beside the kitchen sink. She went to water her plants. That evening, Zora called. She was working on a school project about civil rights law and wanted to know if she could cite the case by name. Adeline said yes. There was a pause, and then Zora asked the question she had been holding since the morning on the plane, the one she had been assembling and waiting for the right moment to ask Grandma, what made you decide not to take it off when she first asked? Adeline thought about Pearl, boarding a bus to Greenville at 18 with a gold chain pressed into her palm, and everything that chain had already survived before Adeline was born, because she said it was never hers to ask me to remove. Zora wrote that down. The necklace is a simple gold chain with a small oval locket that was made in 1951 by a jeweler in Columbia, South Carolina, who has been gone for 40 years, given to a girl on a bus stop by her mother, who saved for 2 years to buy it, worn every day for 73 years, threw everything this country found to put in the way of the woman who wore it unfastened once by a daughter's careful hands in a hospital room in the early morning, and worn by that daughter every day since. The clasp is new. If you look closely, you can see where the gold was rejoined the fine seam of the repair. It does not look like damage. It looks like what it is, the place where something was broken, held, and made whole again. Which is its own kind of story, its own kind of strength, and no one's to remove. If this story moved you, please like it and subscribe to our channel, because the fight for dignity doesn't end here, and the next story we tell might be the one that changes everything.